Hola chicos, esta noche nosotros vamos a adentrarnos en los corredores silenciosos de palacios, donde los espejos reflejan más que vanidad, reflejan siglos de secretos enterrados en la sangre real. Tú caminas por mármoles fríos donde una vez pisaron las mujeres más poderosas del mundo, pero también las más prisioneras de su propio linaje. Sus fantasmas susurran desde los tapiques dorados, contando historias de matrimonios que fueron tanto coronaciones como condenas. Esta historia puede resolver misterios que ni siquiera sabías que tenías sobre, porque algunas reinas parecían destinadas a la tragedia desde su nacimiento. Como si el destino hubiera sido tejido en sus genes mucho antes de que respiraran su primer aliento. Entonces, antes de explorar la historia conmigo, tómate un momento para ayudarme y suscribirme al canal. Dale me gusta y comparte este video. O quizás deja un comentario a continuación, pero asegúrate de hackearlo cuando realmente te gusta lo que te traigo. Me encantaría saber dónde y cuándo empezaste a ver este video. O simplemente déjame un cumplido si te sientes generoso esta noche. Tal vez estás acurrucado en tu cama favorita. O quizás estás en el sofá con una manta suave. Cuéntame tu ritual nocturno. Ahora, mantengamos las luces lo más suaves posible. Encendemos el ventilador para un sonido suave que ayude a que la historia se sienta más emotiva y emprendamos juntos el viaje de esta noche. Tú te encuentras en Alejandría. En el año 51 a.C., el aire mediterráneo leva el aroma de mirra e incienso, mezclado con el perfume exótico de jardines que florecen bajo la luna egipcia. Pero también hay algo más sutil en el ambiente. El peso de 3 siglos de tradición que está a punto de coronar a su última guardiana. El viento nocturno susurra secretos entre las columnas de mármol mientras caminas hacia el gran palacio ptolemaico, donde una joven de 18 años se prepara para un ritual que ha definido a su dinastía desde que Alejandro Magno conquistó estas tierras doradas y las entregó a sus generales más leales. Cleopatra, Mrs. Filopator se encuentra frente a un espejo de bronce pulido que refleja no solo su rostro, sino siglos de historia familiar. Sus ojos, que pronto cautivaron a los hombres más poderosos de Roma, reflejan una inteligencia feroz, pero también el peso de un linaje que ha permanecido puro durante 300 años. Tú observas cómo sus sirvientas la visten con sedas que parecen líquidas bajo la luz de las antorchas, adornándola con joyas que han decorado arenas ptolemaicas durante generaciones. Pero lo que no pueden vestir es la realidad genética que corre por sus venas como un río dorado y peligroso. Ella es el producto de generaciones de matrimonios entre hermanos, tíos y sobrinas, primos que compartían no solo tronos dorados, sino pools genéticos tan similares que sus árboles genealógicos parecían espejos reflejándose infinitamente. Los ptolemaicos habían convertido la endogamia en un arte tan refinado como sus esculturas de mármol. Desde Ptolomeo I, el general macedonio de Alejandro, que se había proclamado faraón y fundado una dinastía que duraría 3 siglos, hasta esta última descendiente que ahora ajusta su diadema real. La familia había seguido las tradiciones faraónicas egipcias de matrimonio entre hermanos con una dedicación que bordeaba la obsesión religiosa. Tú puedes casi sentir el eco de las ceremonias nupciales pasadas resonando en estos mismos salones de columnas doradas, donde hermanos se casaban con hermanas no por amor romántico, sino por la preservación de lo que ellos consideraban sangre divina, tan pura como el oro que adorna sus coronas. La historia convencional nos dice que los ptolemaicos adoptaron esta práctica de los faraones egipcios nativos, quienes creían que la sangre real era literalmente divina y no debía ser contaminada por linajes menores. Pero aquí tienes una curiosidad que pocos conocen. Los registros de papiro sugieren que algunos miembros de la familia ptolemaica sufrían de hemofilia, una condición que se vuelve más común en linajes altamente endogámicos. Imagina las ceremonias reales donde los novios sangraban fácilmente, considerando sus heridas como signos de su naturaleza divina cuando en realidad eran síntomas de su patrimonio genético comprometido. Pero Cleopatra es diferente, y tú lo percibes en la forma en que sostiene su barbilla con una confianza que parece desafiar tanto a los dioses como a la genética, a diferencia de muchos de sus antecesores, que habían sucumbido a las debilidades físicas y mentales que acompañan a la endogamia severa. Él parece haber heredado lo mejor de su linaje: la inteligencia aguda como una daga, la astucia política de una serpiente sabia, y una presencia que comandaba respeto antes de que pronunciara una sola palabra. Los historiadores aún discuten si su famosa belleza era física o si simplemente poseía ese magnetismo especial que solo viene con la absoluta confianza en el propio poder divino. Tú la sigues mientras se dirige al templo para su coronación nocturna, una tradición ptolemaica que conectaba a los faraones con los misterios nocturnos de Isis. Sus pasos resuenan en el mármol frío, cada eco levándola más cerca de un destino que había sido escrito en su ADN mucho antes de su primer grito al nacer. Las antorchas proyectan sombras danzantes en las paredes decoradas con jeroglíficos que cuentan las historias de sus ancestros. Cada símbolo un recordatorio de que ella no es solo la última de los ptolemaicos. Es el experimento final de una dinastía que apostó todo a la pureza de sangre. La ironía te envuelve como la brisa salada del Mediterráneo que se filtra por las ventanas del palacio. Esta mujer, que se convertiría en el símbolo eterno del poder femenino en el mundo antiguo, era también la culminación viviente de uno de los experimentos endogámicos más extremos de la historia humana. Sus padres habían sido hermanos, sus abuelos habían sido primos hermanos, Y si rastrearas su árbol genealógico, descubrirías que se parecía más a una escalera que a un árbol con ramas diversas. Tú viajas ahora hacia el norte, dejando atrás el cálido abrazo del Mediterráneo para adentrarte en las brumas frías de Castilla, donde los vientos susurran historias de una reina cuyo nombre se ha convertido en sinónimo de locura. Es el año 1479 y caminas por los pasillos de piedra del castillo de Tordesillas, donde los ecos de risas histéricas y llanto desconsolado se mezclan con el sonido de cadenas que arrastran contra el suelo de mármol manchado por lágrimas reales. Juana de Castilla, conocida cruelmente por la historia como Juana la Loca, se mece en una silla talada junto a una ventana que da a los campos dorados de trigo. Tú observas sus manos temblorosas mientras acarilla un retrato de su esposo muerto, Felipe el Hermoso, susurrando palabras de amor a una imagen que ya no puede responderle, pero lo que ves no es simplemente una mujer enloquecida por el dolor. Es el producto inevitable de generaciones de matrimonios consanguíneos que habían convertido a la casa de Trastamara en un laberinto genético sin salida. Los Trastamara habían comenzado su reinado en España con ambiciones nobles, pero como muchas dinastías reales, pronto descubrieron que mantener el poder requería mantener la sangre pura. Tú puedes rastrear la locura de Juana a través de su árbol genealógico como si fuera un mapa de una enfermedad hereditaria, donde su bisabuela, María de Padilla, había mostrado signos de inestabilidad mental. Su abuela, Isabel de Portugal, había sufrido episodios de melancolía tan profundos que se negaba a salir de sus habitaciones durante meses. Su madre, la famosa Isabel la Católica, había logrado controlar sus propias tendencias depresivas a través de una fe religiosa férrea. Pero el precio genético se estaba acumulando como una deuda que eventualmente tendría que ser pagada, etc. La historia convencional pinta a Juana como una mujer que perdió la razón por amor. Pero tú descubres una verdad más compleja, tras examinas los registros médicos preservados en los archivos del Vaticano. Los síntomas que los cronistas describían como locura de amor coinciden perfectamente con lo que los psiquiatras modernos reconocerían como trastorno bipolar severo, una condición que tiene componentes genéticos fuertes y que se intensifica dramáticamente en poblaciones endogámicas. Aquí tienes una curiosidad fascinante que pocos historiadores mencionan. Juana no era la única en su familia que mostraba estos síntomas. Su hermano Juan, el príncipe heredero, había mostrado comportamientos obsesivos y episodios de rage que los cortesanos atribuían su temperamento real. Su hermana Catalina, que se convertiría en la primera esposa de Enrique VII, sufría de episodios de depresión tan severos que a menudo se quedaba en cama durante semanas, algo que sus médicos describían como melancolía de sangre real. Era como si la locura fuera el precio que los Trastamara pagaban por su corona. Tú caminas por los aposentos privados de Juana y puedes sentir la tragedia impregnada en las piedras. Las ventanas están cubiertas con cortinas, pesadas porque la luz del día la agitaba, haciendo que gritara que los rayos del sol estaban tratando de robar el alma de Felipe de su retrato. Los historiadores aún discuten si su comportamiento era genuinamente psicótico o si fue exagerado por sus enemigos políticos para justificar su encarcelamiento. Pero los registros médicos contemporáneos sugieren que sus síntomas eran muy reales y muy severos. Lo más trágico de la historia de Juana es que ella era plenamente consciente de su condición durante sus momentos de lucidez. Los archivos contienen cartas que escribió a su padre, Fernando de Aragón, suplicando que la liberara, explicando con una claridad dolorosa que sus episodios eran temporales y que durante sus periodos de calma era perfectamente capaz de gobernar. La locura viene y va como las mareas. Escribió en una carta que nunca fue enviada. Pero mi amor por Castilla permanece constante, como las estrellas. Su tragedia personal se volvió aún más cruel cuando consideramos que sus hijos heredaron no solo su trono, sino también sus genes. Carlos V, su hijo mayor, luchó toda su vida contra episodios de lo que sus médicos llamaban melancolía real, una condición que lo llevaba a encerrarse en monasterios durante meses, alejándose de las responsabilidades del gobierno del imperio más grande del mundo. Su hija Catalina mostró signos similares de inestabilidad emocional, creando un patrón que se repetiría en la casa de Austria durante generaciones. Y no. Tú observas un detalle que revela la profundidad de su tragedia. En su escritorio hay docenas de cartas nunca enviadas, todas dirigidas a Felipe, todas escritas después de su muerte. En ellas, Juana no solo expresaba su amor eterno, sino que también discutía asuntos de Estado con una lucidez que contradecía completamente su reputación de locura. Era como si su mente brillante estuviera atrapada en un cuerpo que había heredado los defectos acumulados de generaciones de endogamia. La ironía final de Juana la loca es que su locura puede haber sido la respuesta más cuerda posible a las circunstancias imposibles de su vida, atrapada entre las ambiciones políticas de su padre, las intrigas de su esposo y las limitaciones genéticas de su herencia. El refugio en la fantasía puede haber sido su única forma de supervivencia emocional. Sus episodios psicóticos le permitían escapar temporalmente de una realidad que había sido diseñada para destruirla desde el momento de su concepción. Mientras te alejas de Tordesillas, tú puedes escuchar sus lamentos flotando en el viento nocturno, un recordatorio eterno de que la pureza de sangre irreversible a menudo venía con un precio que se pagaba en cordura, felicidad, y en última instancia, en la humanidad misma de quienes la poseían. Tú te deslizas ahora por los salones de espejos de Versalles, donde la luz de 1000 velas danza sobre superficies doradas y crea sombras parecen moverse con vida propia. Es 1774, y el aire está cargado con el perfume de rosas francesas y el aroma más sutil del miedo aristocrático. Camina siguiendo el susurro de sedas y el tintineo delicado de joyas hasta llegar a los aposentos privados donde una joven reina de 19 años se mira en un espejo ornamentado, sin saber que está contemplando no solo su propio reflejo, sino el rostro de una dinastía condenada. María Antonieta de Austria se ajusta una peluca empolvada que se eleva como una torre de encalle, y plumas. Una moda tan extravagante que parece desafiar tanto a la gravedad como al sentido común. Pero tú sabes que esta opulencia superficial oculta una verdad más oscura. Ella es el producto de siglos de matrimonios Habsburg, que han tejido una red tan compleja de parentesco que su árbol genealógico parece más un nudo imposible de desatar. Sus mejillas rosadas y su risa cristalina esconden los guiñines que han viajado por Europa durante generaciones, acumulando mutaciones como una bola de nieve genética rodando cuesta abajo hacia el desastre. Los Habsburg habían perfeccionado el arte de la endogamia, real hasta convertirla en una ciencia tan precisa como sus relojes suizos. Desde el siglo XV, habían seguido el lema familiar Bella gerant Ali tu Felix Austria nube. Que otros hagan la guerra. Tú, afortunada Austria, casate. Pero lo que comenzó como una estrategia política para adelante, se había convertido en una trampa genética que atrapaba a cada nueva generación en un laberinto de ADN defectuoso. Tú puedes rastrear la herencia de María Antonieta como un detective siguiendo pistas en una novela de misterio. Su madre, María Teresa, era hija de primos hermanos. Su padre, Francisco III, descendía de una línea tan endogámica que compartía ancestros con su esposa en al menos 6 puntos diferentes de su árbol genealógico. La historia convencional presenta a María Antonieta como una reina frívola que perdió su cabeza por su extravagancia. Pero tú descubres una narrativa más compleja mientras examinas los registros médicos conservados en los archivos imperiales austriacos. Los síntomas que los médicos de la corte francesa describían como nervios delicados y constitución sensible, coinciden con patrones genéticos que los científicos modernos reconocerían como consecuencias directas de la endogamia severa. Problemas de fertilidad, tendencias a la depresión y una fragilidad física que requería cuidados médicos constantes. Aquí tienes una curiosidad fascinante que raramente aparece en los libros de historia. María Antonieta sufrió de lo que sus médicos llamaban flujos blancos, una condición que probablemente era endometriosis, una enfermedad que tiene componentes genéticos fuertes y que aparece con mayor frecuencia en poblaciones endogámicas. Esta condición no solo causaba dolor físico constante, sino que también dificultaba enormemente la concepción, creando presión política intensa sobre una reina cuyo trabajo principal era producir herederos para Francia. Sus primeros 7 años de matrimonio fueron un calvario de tratamientos médicos invasivos, dietas especiales y la humillación constante de tener su ciclo menstrual monitoreado por médicos de la corte como si fuera un experimento científico. Tú la observas mientras se somete a su rutina matutina de preparación. Un ritual que toma más de 3 horas y requiere la participación de docenas de sirvientas, pero más allá de la superficialidad aparente. Puedes ver los signos sutiles de su herencia genética, la forma ligeramente asimétrica de su mandíbula, heredada de generaciones de Habsburg, la validez enfermiza que requiere capas de cosméticos para ocultarse, las manos que tiemblan ligeramente cuando cree que nadie está mirando. Un síntoma que los médicos modernos reconocerían como posible evidencia de trastornos neurológicos menores relacionados con la endogamia. Los historiadores aún discuten si María Antonieta realmente pronunció la famosa frase que coman pasteles cuando se le informó que el pueblo no tenía pan. Pero los registros médicos revelan una verdad más interesante. Ella sufría de episodios de lo que sus médicos describían como ausencias mentales. Periodos durante los cuales parecía desconectada de la realidad que la rodeaba. Estos episodios pueden haber sido pequeñas convulsiones o síntomas disociativos. Ambas condiciones que aparecen con mayor frecuencia en individuos con alta consanguinidad. Su tragedia personal se intensifica cuando consideras que ella era plenamente consciente de su diferencia de ti. En cartas privadas a su hermana María Carolina, reina de Nápoles, María Antonieta escribía sobre sus debilidades heredadas y su temor de que sus hijos pudieran heredar lo que ella llamaba la maldición de nuestra sangre. Era una profecía que se cumpliría de maneras que ella nunca podría haber imaginado. Su hijo Luis Carlos, el delfín, moriría joven de tuberculosis, una enfermedad que ataca más severamente a individuos con sistemas inmunológicos comprometidos por la endogamia. Tú caminas por los jardines de Versalles, donde María Antonieta jugaba a ser pastora en su aldea artificial. El Petit Trianon, esta fantasía pastoral no era solo un capricho aristocrático. Era su forma de escapar de una realidad que había sido diseñada por generaciones de ancestros, que valoraban la pureza de sangre por encima de la salud, la felicidad o incluso la supervivencia. En estos jardines cuidadosamente diseñados para parecer naturales, ella podía pretender ser una campesina simple, libre de las cargas genéticas que la perseguían en el palacio principal. La ironía final de María Antonieta es que su ejecución durante la Revolución Francesa fue vista por muchos como el justo castigo por su extravagancia. Pero la verdad es más compleja. Ella era tanto víctima como símbolo de un sistema que había sacrificado generaciones de bienestar humano en el altar de la pureza dinástica. Su cabeza rodó no solo por sus propios excesos, sino por los pecados genéticos acumulados de siglos de ancestros que habían elegido el poder político sobre la salud biológica. Mientras el viento nocturno susurra entre los árboles perfectamente podados de Versalles, tú puedes casi escuchar el eco de su risa. ahora para siempre silenciada, mandí. Pero que una vez había intentado desesperadamente encontrar alegría en un mundo que había sido diseñado para destruirla desde el momento de su concepción en los palacios endogámicos de Viena. Tú cruzas ahora el Canal de la Mancha en una noche brumosa, donde las olas grises golpean contra acantilados blancos que han presenciado siglos de invasiones, matrimonios reales y tragedias dinásticas. El viento salado le eleva susurros de Greenwich, donde caminas por los pasillos de un palacio que aún resuena con los ecos de argumentos matrimoniales que cambiarían el curso de la religión europea para siempre. Es 1509, y tú sigues el susurro de sedas españolas hasta una habitación, donde una joven princesa de 23 años se prepara para un destino que había sido escrito en su sangre mucho antes de que respirara su primer aliento inglés. Catalina de Aragón se mira en un espejo veneciano mientras sus damas de compañía ajustan su vestido de terciopelo bordado con hilos de oro que capturan la luz como pequeños soles. Su rostro, que eleva la serenidad digna de una infanta española, oculta una verdad genética que se revelará en los años venideros de la manera más cruel posible. Ella es portadora de los mismos genes endogámicos que habían condenado a su hermana Juana a la locura y que eventualmente destruirían sus propias esperanzas de ser madre de reyes ingleses. Los matrimonios de Catalina revelan la complejidad cruel del sistema dinástico europeo. Primero fue casada con Arturo, príncipe de Gales, en una ceremonia que unía a Inglaterra y España en una alianza que prometía estabilidad continental. Pero Arturo murió apenas 5 meses después de la boda, dejando a Catalina en un limbo político y emocional que duraría 6 años. Tú puedes sentir la soledad que se filtra por las piedras del palacio mientras ella esperaba. Técnicamente viuda pero prácticamente prisionera, a que los políticos decidieran su destino como si fuera una pieza de ajedrez en lugar de un ser humano con corazón y alma. Su segundo matrimonio con Enrique XVI comenzó como un cuento de hadas. Pero tú sabes que estaba condenado desde el principio por razones que iban más allá de la política o la personalidad. Los registros médicos preservados en los archivos del Vaticano revelan una historia que los cronistas de la época no se atrevían a contar completamente. Catalina sufría de lo que sus médicos españoles habían diagnosticado como matriz fría, una condición que probablemente era endometriosis severa, heredada a través de generaciones de matrimonios consanguíneos en las casas reales ibéricas. Aquí tienes una curiosidad médica fascinante que pocas biografías mencionan: los registros detallados de los embarazos de Catalina, mantenidos por sus confesores, revelan un patrón devastador de abortos espontáneos que coincide perfectamente con lo que los genetistas modernos reconocerían como incompatibilidad genética severa. De 6 embarazos confirmados, solo uno resultó en un hijo que sobrevivió más? ¿A la de la infancia, María? ¿Quién más tarde sería conocida como Bloody Mary? ¿Y quién heredaría no solo el trono, sino también las tendencias depresivas y la fragilidad física que caracterizaban a su linaje materno? Tú caminas por los jardines de Grain, donde Catalina pasaba horas en contemplación, y puedes ver cómo su fe católica profunda se intensificaba con cada pérdida. Cada aborto espontáneo era interpretado por sus confesores como una prueba divina. Pero los médicos moros que ocasionalmente la atendían en secreto notaban patrones que sugerían causas genéticas más que espirituales. Sus cartas privadas a su madre, Isabel la Católica, revelan una mujer que sufría no solo físicamente, sino también emocionalmente, preguntándose si había hecho algo para merecer esta maldición de la infertilidad. Los historiadores aún discuten si el famoso gran asunto del rey Enrique VIII realmente se basaba en escrúpulos religiosos sobre casarse con la viuda de su hermano, o si simplemente era una excusa conveniente para deshacerse de una esposa que no podía darle herederos varones, pero los registros médicos sugieren una tercera posibilidad más sutil. Enrique puede haber desarrollado una comprensión intuitiva de que los problemas reproductivos de Catalina no eran temporales o curables, sino fundamentalmente genéticos. Tú observas a Catalina durante sus últimos años en Inglaterra, cuando ya había sido repudiada y vivía prácticamente en el exilio en el castillo de Kimbolton. Sus aposentos, que una vez habían sido decorados con tapices españoles que contaban historias de la Reconquista, ahora están casi vacíos. Pero ella mantiene su dignidad real con una determinación que desafía tanto a su ex esposo como a su destino genético. Sus únicas compañías son algunas damas españolas leales y sus libros de oración. Pero en la soledad de sus noches largas, tú puedes ver cómo ella finalmente encuentra una paz que había eludido durante toda su vida matrimonial. La ironía más profunda de la historia de Catalina es que su fracaso como reina consorte llevó directamente a la Reforma Inglesa, uno de los eventos más importantes en la historia europea. Su incapacidad genética para producir herederos varones destruyó su matrimonio, pero también liberó a Inglaterra del control papal y estableció las bases para el eventual imperio británico. Era como si sus genes defectuosos hubieran sido el catalizador accidental para una revolución religiosa que cambiaría el mundo. Su muerte en 1536 fue oficialmente atribuida a una enfermedad larga, pero las descripciones de sus síntomas finales, dolor abdominal severo, pérdida de peso dramática y episodios de delirio, sugieren que puede haber sido cáncer. Una enfermedad que aparece con mayor frecuencia en individuos con alta consanguinidad. Sus últimas palabras, según sus damas de compañía, fueron una oración en español pidiendo perdón por sus pecados de sangre. Una frase que puede haber reflejado una comprensión intuitiva de que su tragedia personal había tenido raíces genéticas. Tú te alejas del castillo de Kimbolton mientras la niebla inglesa envuelve sus torres, llevándote hacia otras cortes europeas donde otras mujeres reales enfrentaban las mismas maldiciones genéticas. El viento que sopla desde el mar del norte lleva consigo el aroma de sal y la tristeza eterna de una mujer que había sido tan devota, tan digna y tan completamente traicionada por la herencia que corría por sus venas como un río envenenado de nobleza. Tú navegas ahora por los canales brumosos del Sena, donde las torres de Notre Dame se elevan como dedos de piedra señalando hacia un cielo gris que parece cargar el peso de siglos de secretos reales. Caminas por los pasillos del Louvre, donde el aroma de cera de vela se mezcla con el perfume de lirios franceses y algo más sutil. El aire enrarecido de la melancolía hereditaria es 1615. Tú sigues el susurro de sedas austriacas hasta los aposentos donde una joven reina de 24 años lucha contra sombras que no puede nombrar pero que reconoce íntimamente, como si hubieran sido compañeras de toda la vida. Ana de Austria se sienta junto a una ventana que da a los jardines reales, bordando un tapiz con hilos dorados mientras lágrimas silenciosas ruedan por sus mejillas pálidas. Como reina madre de Francia, ella debería estar en el apogeo de su poder político. Pero tú puedes ver cómo leva el peso de una depresión que va más allá de las circunstancias personales. Es una herencia tan tangible como sus joyas de la corona, transmitida a través de generaciones de matrimonios Habsburg que habían convertido la melancolía en un rasgo familiar tan característico como el labio prominente que marcaba a su dinastía. Los Habsburg habían llegado a dominar Europa no solo a través de matrimonios estratégicos, sino también a través de la perpetuación de rasgos genéticos que incluían tanto grandeza intelectual como fragilidad emocional. Ana era hija de Felipe III de España y Margarita de Austria, una unión que representaba la quinta generación consecutiva de matrimonios entre primos en la línea Habsburg. Tú puedes rastrear su herencia depresiva como un genealogista siguiendo un patrón. Su bisabuela, María Manuela de Portugal, había muerto joven después de episodios severos de melancolía. Su abuela, Ana de Austria, la cuarta esposa de Felipe II, había sufrido lo que los médicos de la corte describían como humores negros perpetuos. La historia convencional presenta a Ana como una reina consorte relativamente menor, overshadowed by the brilliance of her son Louis XIII, pero tú descubres una narrativa más compleja mientras examinas sus cartas privadas preservadas en los archivos de la Biblioteca Nacional Francesa. Sus descripciones de lo que ella llamaba la oscuridad que viene con el amanecer coinciden perfectamente con síntomas de depresión severa, una condición que los médicos del siglo XVI no sabían cómo tratar excepto con sangrías y oraciones. Aquí tienes una curiosidad médica fascinante que revela la profundidad de su sufrimiento. Ana mantenía un diario secreto donde registraba sus días de sombra versus sus días de luz, creando inadvertidamente uno de los primeros registros detallados de trastorno bipolar en la literatura real europea. Sus patrones de humor seguían ciclos tan regulares que sus damas de compañía aprendieron a predecir cuándo necesitaría estar completamente sola versus cuándo podría a participar en las ceremonias de la corte. Tú la observas durante sus rituales matutinos, donde el proceso de vestirla como reina toma más de 2 horas no solo por la complejidad de la moda francesa, sino porque muchas mañanas sus manos temblaban tanto que no podía sostener una taza de chocolate caliente sin ayuda. Los historiadores aún discuten si estos temblores eran síntomas de ansiedad o evidencia de condiciones neurológicas menores relacionadas con la endogamia Habsburg. Pero los registros médicos sugieren que ella sufría de ambos. Su maternidad se convirtió en una fuente tanto de alegría como de terror genético, cuando finalmente dio a luz al futuro Luis XIII después de 22 años de matrimonio. Él la escribió en su diario: Dios me ha bendecido con un hijo, pero temo las sombras que puede haber heredado de mi sangre. Su intuición maternal resultaría profética. Luis XIII, a pesar de su grandeza como rey, luchó durante toda su vida contra episodios de lo que sus médicos llamaban melancolía real, especialmente después de las muertes de sus hijos y nietos. Tú caminas por la galería donde Ana comisionaba retratos familiares y puedes ver cómo intentaba crear una narrativa visual de estabilidad dinástica que contradecía completamente su experiencia interna. En estos retratos, ella aparece serena y majestuosa, rodeada de símbolos de poder y fertilidad, pero sus ojos cargan una tristeza que ningún artista podía completamente ocultar. Era como si estuviera posando para la posteridad mientras luchaba privately contra demonios que habían sido painted into her genetic code by centuries of Habsburg intermarriage. Su correspondencia con sus hermanas, especialmente con María Ana de Austria, quien se casaría con su primo Felipe de España, revela una red de mujeres reales que compartían no solo parentesco sino también patrones similares de sufrimiento emocional. Se escribían cartas cifradas donde discutían sus humores melancólicos, usando metáforas de weather y estaciones, creando un lenguaje secreto para describir experiencias que la medicina de su época no podía explicar. Efectivamente, la ironía más profunda de Ana de Austria es que ella crió al rey que se convertiría en el símbolo definitivo del absolutismo europeo. Pero lo hizo mientras luchaba contra una condición que la hacía sentir completamente powerless sobre su propio bienestar emocional. Luis XIII aprendió sobre kingship, watching his mother navigate not only political intrigue, but also psychological territories que were completely unmapped by 17th century science. Durante sus últimos años, Ana encontró refugio en una religiosidad cada vez más intensa, pasando horas en prayer que sus confesores interpretaban como devoción, pero que probablemente eran también una forma de meditación que proporcionaba relief temporal de su anxiety genética. Su capilla privada se convirtió en un sanctuary donde podía admit her vulnerabilities without compromising her public image como reina madre de Francia. Tú te alejas del Louvre mientras las campanas de Notre Dame sueñan en la hora vespertina, levándote hacia otros países europeos donde otras mujeres Habsburg enfrentaban batallas similares contra inheritances que eran tanto crown como curse, tanto privilege como prisión genético que no podían escape, no matter how high their royal rank. Tú desciendes ahora por los escalones de mármol hacia las criptas imperiales de Viena, donde el aire frío leva el aroma de incienso eterno, no y el peso de siglos de ambición Habsburg. Caminas por corredores subterráneos donde los ecos de tus pasos se mezclan con susurros de mujeres que murieron demasiado joven, levando secretos genéticos que nunca pudieron nombrar. Es 1673 y tú emerges en los jardines del Hofburg, donde una niña de 13 años llega con muñecas de porcelana que pronto serán reemplazadas por responsabilidades que destruirán su infancia y eventualmente su vida. Margarita Teresa de Austria, infanta de España y futura emperatriz del Sacro Imperio Romano, corre por los jardines con una gracia que parece desafiar las leyes de la física. Pero tú puedes ver en la delicadeza de sus movimientos los primeros signos de una fragilidad que había sido bred into her bones a través de generaciones de Habsburg intermarriage. Sus mejillas rosadas y su risa musical ocultan una verdad genética devastadora. Ella es el producto de la unión entre su tío y su sobrina, una combinación que había concentrado los defectos Habsburg hasta un punto casi experimental. Los retratos de Velázquez habían capturado su belleza ethereal, pero lo que no podían pintar era el mapa genético complejo que corría por sus venas como un river de nobility tainted. Su padre, Felipe IV de España, era hermano de su madre, Mariana de Austria, creando un nivel de consanguinidad tan extremo que los genetistas modernos lo clasificarían como incestuous. Tú puedes trazar su herencia como un detective siguiendo clues en un crimen que había sido committed against biology itself. Cada ancestor compartido aumentaba las probabilidades de que él heredara not just one copy de genes defectuosos, but two identical copies que se amplificarían mutuamente. La historia convencional presenta a Margarita Teresa como una princesa fairy-tale que se casó con el emperador Leopoldo y vivió happily ever after. Pero tú descubres una narrativa más dark mientras examinas los registros médicos preservados en los archivos secretos del Vaticano. Sus síntomas, que los médicos de la corte austriaca describían como constitución delicata y incluían episodios de fatiga extrema, bleeding episodes, que sugerían problemas de coagulación, y lo que sus confesores llamaban spells of absence, que probablemente eran césures menores. Aquí tienes una curiosidad médica que revela la tragedia de su situación. Margarita Teresa fue subject to one de los primeros documented cases de genetic counseling en la historia europea. Los médicos moros que servían discretamente en la corte española habían desarrollado una primitive understanding de inheritance patterns y advirtieron contra su marriage to Leopoldo, quien era también su primo hermano. Sus warnings fueron dismissed como superstition, pero sus predictions resultaron tragically accurate. Tú la observas durante her wedding ceremony en 1666, donde ella aparece como una visión en silk blanco y diamonds. Pero puedes ver cómo her hand shakes slightly mientras sostiene el bouquet. Sus 5 años de mariage serían una sucesión de pregnancies que ended in tragedy. 4 children nacidos, pero solo uno que sobreviviría past infancy. Cada loss era more devastating porque both she y her doctors comenzaban a recognize patterns que suggested algo fundamentally wrong con her reproductive system. Los historiadores aún discuten si her early death a los 22 años fue causada por complications del childbirth o por underlying genetic conditions. Pero los detailed records mantenidos por sus physicians sugieren una combination of both. Sus final pregnancy resultó and what modern medicine would recognize como sepsis postpartum. Pero her inability to recover sugiere un immune system que había sido compromised por generaciones de inbreeding. Su correspondence privada con her younger sister, María Antonia, quien se convertiría en electora de Bavaria, revela una young woman who era intellectually curious, not emotionally sensitive, pero también increasingly aware que something era wrong con her physical constitution. I feel como if my body were made de glass. Escribió en una carta que nunca fue sent. Beautiful to look at, but ready to shatter on cualquier moment. Tú caminas por her private chambers en el Hofburg, donde she había comisionado paintings de children que she hoped to have. Optimistic visions que contrasted sharply con la reality de her genetic inheritance. These rooms, decorated con tapestries que depicted healthy, thriving families, se convirtieron en monuments to dreams que biology había made impossible to fulfill. La ironía most profound de Margarita Teresa's story es que her marriage to Leopoldo había sido arranged not just para political reasons, but because both families believed que, combining their pure bloodlines, resultaría en children que would be even more noble and powerful than their parents. Instead, the marriage produced exactly el opposite. Children que were increasingly frail, y susceptible to diseases. Que seemed to target royal families specifically. Her only surviving child, Maria Antonia, would carry forward the genetic legacy que Margarita Teresa había inherited, eventually passing it to her own children y perpetuating cycles de royal suffering que would continue para generations, era como si cada generation. The Habsburg women were paying compound interest in una genetic debt que their ancestors habían incurred centuries earlier. Durante her final illness, Margarita Teresa reportedly asked her confessor si God was punishing her family para some ancient sin. La question reveals una intuitive understanding que her suffering wasn't random, But parte algo, larger and more systematic, her death became another entry, en el long ledger de Habsburg women quien had paid the ultimate price para their family's obsession con bloodline purity. Tu te alejas del Hofburg mientras las bells de San Stephen's Cathedral ring vespers, carrying el sound across Vienna como un lament. Para all the royal children quien had died too young, victims de genetic experiments disguised como dynastic marriages, sacrifices en el altar de un ideal de purity que had become indistinguishable from poison. Tú te deslizas ahora por los salones susurrantes del Escorial, donde las sombras de granito parecen guardar secretos que ni siquiera los confesores se atreven a whisper. Caminas por corredores, donde el aire está thick con el aroma de frankincense, y el weight más sutil de unspoken tragedies. Es 1683, y tú sigues el hecho delicate de footsteps hacia una chamber, donde una young woman de 20 años se sienta en darkness, casi completa, y rodeada por portraits, the ancestors whose genetic legacy she carries, como una curses. Disguised como nobility, Maria Antonia de Austria, archiduquesa y sister, menor de Maria Antonieta, exists en una shadow que history barely acknowledges, pero tú sabes que. Her story illuminates patterns que will run through royal bloodlines, como underground rivers, de genetic disaster. Ella es el product de la Same Habsburg intermarriage que produced her more famous sister. Pero where Maria Antonieta había inherited enough genetic diversity para survive hasta adultos, Maria Antonia carries the concentrated essence de centuries de consanguinity como una genetic time bomb, ticking in her DNA. Los records de su birth revelan una truth que los court physicians intentaron desperately to hide. Ella había nacido con what they discreetly called irregularities de formation, physical abnormalities, que modern genetics would recognize como classic signs de severe inbreeding. Her left arm era slightly shorter que her right. Her spine curved on una way que required specially designed corsets. Why? Her facial features, while still recognizably beautiful, showed the subtle asymmetries que marked her bloodline. Como surely como heraldic symbols marked her clothing. La Historia Convencional barely mentions Maria Antonia Pork. She died before reaching political significance. Pero tú descubres que her brief life provides un window into the everyday reality de living, con genetic inheritance. Que royal families preferred to ignore her private letters, preserved on secret archives de la Biblioteca del Escorial, reveal una young woman quien era painfully aware de her physical differences, pero struggled to understand why God había made her imperfect when her family claimed divine right to rule. Aquí tienes una medical curiosity que demonstrates the systematic nature. The Habsburg genetic problems, Maria Antonia suffered from what her doctors called bleeding sickness, una condition que modern medicine would diagnose como hemophilia. Esta wasn't coincidence. The disease had been passing through European royal families para generations, hidden behind euphemisms like royal bleeding, o noble frailty. Her menstrual periods were so severe que they often left her bedridden para days. Ya any small cut could become life-threatening. Tú la observas durante her daily routines, where every activity habian to be carefully planned around her physical limitations. She couldn't ride horses, como other noble women. Pork minor falls could cause internal bleeding. She couldn't dance, encore festivities. Porque exertion triggered bleeding episodes, even her religious devotions Habian to be modified. She couldn't kneel para extended periods porque the pressure caused bruising que took weeks to heal. Los historiadores aún discuten si María Antonia's early death. A los 23 años fue accidental. If she deliberately sought to end her suffering. Pero the detailed records. Mantenidos por, her confessors suggest algo more complex. She había developed una profound understanding. De que her genetic inheritance made normal life impossible. Y, she gradually withdrew from activities que other people considered essential to living. Her correspondence con physicians across Europe conducted on secret to avoid embarrassing her family. Reveals una young woman, quien era, surprisingly sophisticated in her understanding de inheritance patterns. She had noticed key marriages between closely related royals produced children con increasing rates de physical problems. Why she had begun to question whether the practice de maintaining pure bloodlines actually God's will, human vanity disguised como religious duty. Two caminas por her private chapel, donde she spent increasing amounts de tiempo durante her final years. Not just en prayer, but in what she called conversations con los santos about the nature de suffering. Her journal entries from this period show una mind que was grappling con profound theological questions about whether genetic inheritance could be considered divine, will cuando it caused so much pain. La tragedie más profound de María Antonia's story es que she había begun to articulate ideas about marriage. Genetics, qui wouldn't be officially recognized por science para another 2 centuries. En letters, que she never sent. She suggested que royal families should consider marriages outside their immediate families to refresh their bloodlines. Ideas que were considered heretical in an era when purity de blood was considered essential to political legitimacy. Her death occurred during what her physicians described como a bleeding episode de unprecedented severity. But the circumstances suggest that she may have been pregnant. Una possibility que would have been both miraculous y devastating given her genetic condition. If true, it means she died attempting to give life, mientras knowing que any child she bore would likely inherit her genetic burdens. Her final letter, addressed to her sister Maria Antonietta, but never delivered, contains what may be one of the earliest explicit acknowledgments de genetic inheritance and royal correspondence. I fear he our family's greatest treasure, our pure blood, may also be our greatest curse. Each generation pays more dearly, para the sins de purity committed por our ancestors. Maria Antonia's funeral fu deliberately understated. Pero you can see in the faces the other Habsburg women. Quien attended, could they recognize themselves in her story? She had become una mirror in which they could see their own genetic destinies. Una reminder que royal blood, no matter how pure, could not protect them from the biological consequences de centuries de family intermarriage. Tu te alejas del escorial mientras. Evening shadows creep across the granite facades, carrying con ellos the whispered prayers de a young woman quien had glimpsed. Truth que her era wasn't ready to acknowledge. Que sometimes the greatest acts de love require abandoning traditions que feel sacred. Even cuando those traditions are destroying the people they're meant to protect. Tu navegas hacia el norte, siguiendo trade routes, que connect Spain con los territorios del Sacro Imperio Romano, hasta llegar a los misty mountains de Austria, donde ancient castles rise como stone guardians protecting secrets que echo through centuries. Caminas por el courtyard del Palacio de Innsbruck, donde morning fog clings to Gothic towers, como veils de morning que never quite lift, as 1526 y tu sigues, whispered conversations en español hacia. Private chambers donde una young woman de 21 años prepares para el destino que will define her como both empress y victim de una genetic inheritance, que runs deeper than royal protocol. Isabel de Portugal se mira en un polished silver mirror, mientras her Portuguese ladies adjust una dress que sparkles con threads de gold. Pero you can see, in her reflection, something que goes beyond mere nervousness about marrying the most powerful man in Europe. Her eyes carry una sadness que seems older than her years, as if she already senses que her marriage to Carlos V will be both the pinnacle de her political value y the beginning de personal struggles que she cannot yet name, but that run in her bloodline como underground rivers de genetic predisposition, los Portuguese royal family. Habia maintained its own traditions de strategic intermarriage, but unlike the extreme endogamy de los Habsburgs, they had occasionally introduced fresh blood from Morocco y other parts de Africa. Creating genetic diversity que was both their secret strength y their public shame, in una era cuando racial purity was considered essential to royal legitimacy. Isabel carries this mixed heritage como una hidden asset, her immune system as stronger, her reproductive capacity more robust, pero también como una source de anxiety porque she knows que some members de Carlos's court whisper about her exotic bloodline. La Historia Convencional presents Isabel como the perfect wife. Para Carlos V, beautiful, pious, politically useful. Pero tu descubres una more complex narrative mientras examinas correspondence between Portuguese y Spanish court physicians. They had conducted what amounted to genetic analysis, comparing family medical histories to predict whether Isabel would be compatible con Carlos's Habsburg inheritance. Their conclusion was optimistic. Her genetic diversity might actually complement his concentrated bloodline, potentially producing healthier children than pure Habsburg unions typically created. Aquí tienes una medical curiosity que reveals the sophistication de Renaissance court medicine. Isabel's physicians on Portugal had maintained detailed records de her menstrual cycles, general health, why even psychological temperament, para casi una decade before her marriage. Creating what was essentially el first documented attempt at genetic counseling and European royal history, they had noted que women and her maternal line rarely suffered from el melancholy sickness, que plagued many royal families, suggesting que her genes might provide resistance to Habsburg depression. Tu la observa durante her wedding ceremony, where she appears radiantly healthy compared to many de her Habsburg relatives who attend the celebration, her posture as straight, her skin clear, her movements graceful but also strong. Physical signs quo. She has inherited protective genes. Q will serve her well during the demanding years ahead, como empress. But you also notice subtle signs. Que she's aware to the genetic burden she's entering. Her prayers during the ceremony include specific requests para healthy children, suggesting Kawe she's been briefed about the reproductive challenges and que face Habsburg women. Los historiadores aún discuten whether Isabel truly loved Carlos o Befete if their marriage was purely political. Pero, her private letters reveal una relationship que became genuinely affectionate despite its arranged nature. More importantly, they show que Isabel developed una sophisticated understanding to her role not just como empress, but como genetic guardian de Habsburg legacy. She approached motherhood with strategic intelligence, consulting physicians across Europe about optimal timing, nutrition, why medical care para maximize the chances de healthy pregnancies. Her success como mother becomes even more remarkable cuando you consider the genetic odds stacked against her. She produced 3 surviving children, including Philip II, quien would become one of Spain's greatest kings. None of them showed the obvious physical deformities and mental instabilities que characterized many Habsburg children of this era. Her genetic contribution essentially reset the Habsburg bloodline, providing una generation de relative health before subsequent intermarriages began concentrating defects again. Tu caminas por the gardens, donde Isabel spent hours walking for exercise during her pregnancies. Following medical advice, que was remarkably advanced. Para its time, she had learned que physical activity, proper nutrition, why avoiding stress could improve pregnancy outcomes, knowledge que she documented on letters to other royal women, creating what amounted to una primitive prenatal care manual que circulated secretly among European courts. La ironía de Isabel's story es que her greatest gift to the Habsburg dynasty, healthy children, came precisely because she was not fully Habsburg herself. Her Portuguese Moorish ancestry provided genetic diversity que strengthened her offspring, but this same diversity was considered somewhat scandalous for courtiers who prized bloodline purity above all else. She had to balance being genetically beneficial mientras appearing genealogically acceptable. Her correspondence with her sister-in-law, Catalina de Austria, reveals conversations about what they discreetly called bloodline management. Discussions about whether royal families should consider marriages que prioritized genetic health over political advantage. These conversations were dangerous porque they questioned fundamental assumptions about divine right why bloodline superiority. But they also show that some royal women were beginning to understand that their family's obsession with purity might be creating more problems than it solved. Durante her later years, como widow, Isabel became una informal consultant para other royal women facing reproductive challenges. Her advice, preserved encoded correspondence, emphasized the importance of introducing genetic diversity whenever possible, even if it meant marrying slightly below one's traditional standards. These letters provide una window into how some royal women began to think differently about genetics decades before formal science caught up on their intuitive understanding. Her death in 1539, few mourned not just porque she was beloved, but because courtiers had begun to recognize que her genetic contribution had been extraordinary. Her children were healthier, more intelligent, more physically robust than most Habsburg offspring, leading some to whisper que royal bloodlines might benefit from occasional, refreshing, congenetically diverse partners. Una idea que would remain controversial for centuries, but that Isabel had proven correct through her own life. Tu te alejas del Innsbruck, palace mientras alpine winds carry the scent of mountain flowers. Remembering una woman quien had served her dynasty not just through political loyalty, but through genetic wisdom que she possessed intuitively, my applied strategically. Even en una era cuando such concepts couldn't be officially acknowledged or scientifically explained. Tú regresas ahora a los austere corredors del Alcázar de Madrid, donde shadows seem heavier y el air carries una oppressive quality que goes beyond the typical formality de Spanish court life. Caminas por rooms que echo con whispers, de regency decisions y political maneuvering, pero también con something more intimate y tragic, the sound de una woman trying to govern an empire, mientras battling demon que had been bred into her bloodline durante generations. Es 1665, y tu si goes, the rustle de black silk hassia. Private chambers donde una queen mother de 46 años rules, not just Spain. Pero también struggles against the genetic inheritance, que threatens to destroy everything she tries to protect. Mariana de Austria sits in complete stillness at her writing desk. Pero tú can see que even her moments de apparent calm are filled contention, como queen mother y regent, para her young son Carlos II. She carries the weight de governing the most powerful empire in the world. Pero también carries something more personal, devastating. The knowledge que her son, the future king, shows clear signs to the genetic deterioration que had been accumulating into the Habsburg bloodline para casi 2 centuries. Her hands? Perfectly still como she writes state documents, occasionally tremble, and una way que suggests she's fighting against impulses que she cannot completely control. Los marriage between Mariana y her uncle Felipe IV había been one de the most endogamous unions in Habsburg history. She was literally his niece. Why their union concentrated Habsburg genes to una degree come modern geneticists would classify como extremely hazardous. Two can trace the mathematical progression de genetic disaster. Each shared ancestor doubled the probability que any genetic defects would be expressed in their offspring. Your Carlos, too, would inherit not just one copy de problematic genes, but often 2 identical copies, quo amplified each other's effects. La historia convencional portrays Mariana como una competent pero unremarkable regent. Pero tú descubres una more complex truth mientras examining secret correspondence between her personal physicians y papal authorities. Her letters reveal una woman quien was painfully aware que something was fundamentally wrong con her family's bloodline, pero también trapped por political circumstances que made it impossible to acknowledge these problems publicly, take meaningful action to address them. Aquí tienes una medical detail que illuminates the systematic nature de Habsburg genetic problems. Mariana herself suffered from what court physicians discreetly called royal epilepsy, una condition que manifested as brief seizures, que she learned to hide through careful timing. De public appearances, strategic use. De private chambers, her seizures followed patterns que modern medicine would recognize como classic absence epilepsy, likely caused por the same genetic factors que produced more severe symptoms in her son. Tu la observa durante her daily routine de governing, donde she must balance running an empire with managing her own health issues, yea, monitoring her son's increasingly obvious disabilities. Carlos, too, Even Como, a young child, showed signs que terrified everyone who saw him. His jaw was so severely malformed que he couldn't chew solid food properly. His tongue was too large. Para his mouth. Yell, he suffered from seizures. Que were far more severe than his mother's discreet episodes. Los historiadores aún discuten whether Mariana understood the genetic basis de her family's problems. Pero, her private diary, written in código that wasn't deciphered until the 20th century, contains entries que suggest she had developed una surprisingly sophisticated understanding de inheritance patterns. She wrote about the sins de our ancestors visiting themselves upon our children. You wondered whether God's will might actually require breaking family traditions. He had become more curse than blessing. Her correspondence con other European royal families reveals una woman quien was quietly investigating alternatives to traditional Habsburg marriage practices. She discreetly inquired about the health records to various potential marriage partners para her son, focusing not just in political advantages, but in what she called constitution strength, essentially conducting primitive genetic screening centuries before such concepts existed officially. Tu caminas por the throne room, donde Mariana conducted state business. Pero you can see que the real drama de her life played out in more private spaces. Her personal chapel había been modified, con special cushions porque prolonged kneeling triggered her seizures. Her dining room featured foods que could be eaten easily. Because she had learned use certain textures could trigger episodes, even her bedroom had been arranged to minimize injury if she had seizures during sleep. La tragédie más profonde de Mariana's Regency era. She was attempting to govern rationally, mientras dealing con irrational genetic inheritance. Que affected both her own mental clarity and her son's capacity to rule. Her political decisions had to account not just para Spain's strategic interests, but also para the medical reality que the Habsburg line was approaching genetic collapse. She was essentially managing the decline de una dynasty, mientras trying to prevent that decline from destroying the empire itself. Her relationship con Carlos II reveals the heartbreak de una mother quien loves her child, but also recognizes que he represents the culmination de genetic mistakes que stretch back generations. Her letters to him are filled con advice about managing his seizures, disguising his physical deformities during public appearances, finding ways to rule effectively despite his cognitive limitations. They read Como instruction manuals, para surviving genetic inheritance. No one wanted to acknowledge publicly. Durante her final years, Como regent, Mariana became increasingly religious, pero not en una way que suggested simple piety. Her confessions, preserved on Vatican archives, reveal que she believed her family was being punished, para marrying too closely to ourselves. Que redemption might require admitting our mistakes y choosing differently. These were dangerous thoughts para una regent, whose legitimacy depended, and maintaining the fiction key royal bloodlines were divinely blessed. Her death in 1696 marked the end de not just uma regency, but uma era de Habsburg, attempt to maintain genetic purity. In the face de mounting evidence, such purity was destroying them. Carlos II would continue to rule Para several more years, but his obvious genetic problem, the inability to produce heirs, meant que the Spanish Habsburg line was essentially already extinct. Mariana had spent her life trying to manage una empire, whilst managing the slow-motion genetic collapse de the dynasty que created it. Tu te alejas del alcázar mientras. Evening shadows lengthen across the courtyards, carrying the weight, the understanding que sometimes the greatest acts to leadership require. Acknowledging cuando traditions that seem sacred have actually become dangerous, even cuando such acknowledgement threatens the very foundation's deep power itself. Tu desciendes, ahora hacia las dark crypts beneath the Capuchin monastery in Vienna, Nenadal, donde the scent de embalming spices mingles con something more elusive. The genetic echo, de leaves that were cut short by inheritance patterns, que seemed designed by fate to create tragedy. Caminas entre stone sarcophagi until you find the modest tomb de una young woman whose brief life illuminates the devastating mathematics de Habsburg endogamy. As 1684, you, although Ana Mauricia de Austria died at apenas 19 años, her story provides una window into how genetic destruction was accelerating a través European royal families como una avalanche, gaining momentum with each generation. Ana Mauricia había been born into what should have been privilege beyond imagination. Daughter de emperador. Leopoldo Thursi, his first wife. Margarita Teresa, making her the product de una union between uncle Nisi Akie, represented the mathematical extreme de Habsburg consanguinity. Two can calculate her genetic burden. Como una scientist working backwards from tragedy. Her parents shared so many ancestors, que her DNA essentially formed patterns, que geneticists would classify como incestuous inheritance, creating biological instabilities que no amount de royal physicians could overcome. Los records de her birth, preserved in the secret archives de the imperial court, reveal una truth que was hidden from public view. Ana Mauricia had been born with multiple congenital abnormalities, que the court physicians struggled to treat usando medieval medical knowledge. Her heart had structural defects, que made her vulnerable to infections. Her immune system was so compromised, que minor illnesses became life-threatening. Her skeletal development was abnormal in ways que required constant medical intervention throughout her short life. La Historia Convencional barely mentions Ana Mauricia because her life was so brief, her disability so severe, que she never played a public role. Pero tu descubre que. Her medical records provide una detailed case study de how extreme endogamy affects human development. Her physicians. Somebody, the most advanced in Europe, documented her condition. Con scientific precision, que reveals patterns que wouldn't be understood officially until the development of modern genetics centuries later. Aquí tienes una medical curiosity que demonstrates the systematic nature de Habsburg genetic problems. Ana Mauricia suffered from what her doctors called glass bone disease, una condition que modern medicine would diagnose como osteogenesis imperfecta. This genetic disorder, which causes extremely fragile bones, appears almost exclusively in populations con high levels de consanguinity. Her skeleton was so fragile que she suffered multiple fractures during normal activities, como walking, or even being lifted by her nursemaids. Tu imaginas her daily life. Confined to specially padded rooms where even gentle movements had to be carefully controlled to prevent injury. Her childhood had no running, no playing, no normal physical development, just endless medical treatments, y careful management de una body que seemed designed to self-destruct. Yet court records also reveal que her mind was sharp, saw her spirit remarkably resilient, suggesting Quay even as her body failed. Her personality retained the intellectual gifts who characterized the best de Habsburg inheritance. Los historiadores aún discuten whether Ana Mauritia's parents understood the connection between their close relationship, their daughter's severe disabilities. Pero private letters between Leopoldo various court physicians suggest that they were beginning to suspect patterns they couldn't quite articulate, references to bloodline weakening. When before discussions about possibly arranging marriages, can healthier foreign houses indicate growing awareness? Something was fundamentally wrong con Habsburg genetic practices. Her medical treatment reveals the intersection between primitive genetics religious belief characterized 17th century medicine. Her physicians tried everything from bloodletting to herbal remedies to religious relics, but they also began documenting family medical histories con unprecedented detail, essentially conducting early genetic research disguised como religious investigation into divine punishment, para-family sins. Two examinas the portraits were commissioned during her brief life. You can see how court artists struggled to depict a child, whose physical deformities were obvious but politically impossible to acknowledge. The paintings show a ethereally beautiful girl, con slightly otherworldly features, but close examination reveals subtle distortions, reflect her underlying genetic conditions, asymmetrical facial features, abnormally delicate bone structure, eyes seem both intelligent haunted by physical pain. No child should have to endure. Her correspondence con her half-sister Maria Antonia reveals una relationship was both tender and tragic. Ana Mauritia wrote letters on una childish hand about her dreams to someday being strong enough to dance at court balls, to ride horses, to have children to her own. Aspirations her physicians knew were medically impossible, but her family couldn't bear to discourage. These letters provide heartbreaking evidence to how genetic inheritance can trap children, and bodies betray their spirits. La ironie más profonde de Ana Mauritia's story. Her death actually provided valuable medical evidence. Would influence Habsburg marriage policies para the next generation. Her autopsy, conducted discreetly by imperial physicians, revealed internal abnormalities. Were so systematic, comprehensive even 17th century doctors began to suspect genetic causation rather than random divine punishment. The detailed anatomical drawings created during her autopsy essentially became una primitive genetic map helped identify patterns de inheritance the family could no longer ignore. Her funeral was deliberately private. Pero the guest list reveals other European royal families were beginning to pay attention to Habsburg genetic problems. Representatives from France, England, Portugal attended not just to pay respects, but to gather information about what they discreetly referred to como bloodline complications might affect their own marriage negotiations con Habsburg partners. Durante the months following her death, court physicians across Europe began corresponding about what they called the Vienna pattern, tendency para Habsburg children to die young from combinations de medical problems seemed to cluster together, and ways suggested common causation. These letters, written in medical Latin to avoid political scrutiny, essentially constituted the first international genetic research network, centuries before such concepts existed officially. Her personal belongings, preserved on museum collections today, tell uma story de uma life lived entirely within medical constraints. Her dolls were specially designed to be unbreakable. Her books were printed on soft paper. Kay wouldn't cut her if she fell while reading. Her clothing was padded to protect her fragile bones from everyday impacts. Every object in her possession had been modified to accommodate genetic fragility. Kay made normal childhood impossible. Tu encuentras. Among her papers, una letter she had begun writing to future Habsburg children. Una document de Kay was never finished, but that reveals her intuitive understanding. Kay, her suffering was part de algo larger than individual misfortune. I pray que someday our family will choose love over bloodline. She had written in her careful script, because keeping blood pure seems to make bodies impure. God surely wants us to be healthy more than he wants us to be royal. Anna Mauritia's brief life had become una genetic warning. Kay, the Habsburg family could no longer completely ignore. Her death prompted the first official discussions about whether certain types of family marriages should be avoided. Conversations Kay would eventually lead to gradual changes in Habsburg marriage policies. Though not before several more generations, the children would pay similar prices, para their ancestors' obsession, con bloodline purity. As evening shadows creep across the monastery, two can almost hear the echo, a young voice asking questions Kay, her era couldn't answer. Why did God make some royal children sick? Why did family love sometimes create family suffering? Why did the blood Kay was supposed to make them special also make them fragile? Her questions would remain unanswered durante her lifetime. But they planted seeds. The Kay would eventually grow into genetic understanding centuries later. Tu te alejas de her tomb mientras the monastery bells ring vespers, carrying the memory de a child whose suffering had served como an unwitting sacrifice to genetic science. Her brief life providing evidence Kay would eventually help other royal families make better choices about love. Marriage. The true meaning de protecting those we care about most. Tu emerges ahora from the underground crypts. Hatia, the golden light, de Vienna's afternoon sun. Pero you carry con ti. The weight de genetic knowledge Kay makes the beautiful Baroque architecture seem fragile. As if these elegant buildings were constructed sober foundations, Kay could collapse without warning. Caminas hacia el Hofburg Palace, donde las afternoon shadows create patterns, que shifty change. Much like the political fortunes de una dynasty Kay was about to face its ultimate genetic reckoning. As 1740, y tu sigues, the sound de determined footsteps, hacia una throne room donde una woman de 22 años prepares to inherit not just an empire but also the accumulated genetic burden, the 8 generations de Habsburg endogamy. Maria Theresa de Austria sits at her father's desk. Reviewing documents, Kay will transfer power to the Spanish Habsburg line. Kay had finally died out Carlos II to the Austrian branch, who she represents. But two can see in her posture something Kay goes beyond normal anxiety about inheriting vast political responsibilities. She carries the visible markers to Habsburg genetic inheritance. The prominent lower jaw, the slightly asymmetrical facial features, the nervous energy Kay suggests underlying neurological sensitivities. Kay had been passed down through generations to family intermarriage. Los Habsburg family had finally been forced to confront the mathematical reality of their genetic practices. Cuando Carlos II died childless in 1700, ending the Spanish line entirely. His death hadn't been unexpected. He had suffered from seizures, mental disabilities, warwai physical deformities, so severe que European courts had been quietly preparing para-Spanish succession. Para-decades, but his genetic legacy served como una wake-up call, que even the most politically conservative royal families could no longer ignore. Extreme endogamy was literally destroying the dynasties. Qui practiced it, La Historia Convencional presents Maria Teresa como una great empress quien modernized the Austrian Empire. He fought successfully against Frederick the Great. Pero tú descubres una more complex narrative mientras examining her private medical records y family correspondence. She was acutely aware que she represented possibly the last generation de Habsburgs quien could successfully reproduce. Yigi, her approach to marriage while motherhood, reflected ona, a sophisticated understanding. The genetic inheritance key was centuries ahead, the official scientific knowledge. Aquí tienes una medical curiosity que reveals her genetic awareness. Maria Teresa conducted what amounted to the first systematic genetic screening program in European royal history. Before arranging marriages, para her children, she ordered detailed investigations into the medical histories de potential partners, focusing specifically in what she called bloodline health, rather than just political advantage. Her correspondence with physicians across Europe essentially created an international network para evaluating genetic compatibility. QA wouldn't be officially recognized por science para another 2 centuries. Tu la observa durante her daily routine de governance, donde she must balance running an empire and managing her own health issues que were clearly related to her Habsburg inheritance. She suffered from what her physicians called royal headaches, severe migraines que modern medicine would recognize como possibly related to the same neurological factors que caused seizures in other family members. Her treatment regimen included dietary restrictions, lifestyle modifications, que suggest she understood connections between genetics, brain function, y overall health. Los historiadores aún discuten whether Maria Teresa's marriage to Francis Stephen de Lorraine was purely political, if genetic considerations played a role. Pero the evidence suggests que she deliberately chose a partner whose family history showed no significant medical problems, whose bloodline was genetically distant from her own. Their children, while still carrying some Habsburg traits, were notably healthier than previous generations de Habsburg offspring, suggesting que her intuitive genetic strategy was successful. Her motherhood reveals una woman quien was determined to break cycles de genetic suffering que had characterized her family para generations. She personally supervised the medical care de her children, consulted physicians from across Europe about optimal nutrition while development. Most importantly, approached their marriage arrangements con genetic health como a primary consideration alongside political advantage. Her decisions about which children to marry to whom reveal una systematic attempt to introduce genetic diversity into Habsburg bloodlines. Tu caminas por the nursery wings de the Hofburg, donde Maria Teresa had implemented what amounted to an early childhood development program designed to identify address potential genetic problems before they became severe. Her children received medical monitoring, que was unprecedented on royal history. Con detailed records to their physical development, mental capabilities. Any signs to the neurological or physical problems que had plagued previous Habsburg generations. La ironía de Maria Teresa's situation era que Her political success came partly because she had been forced to acknowledge genetic realities her predecessors had ignored. Her empire survived. Why thrived? Because she had begun to prioritize genetic health over bloodline purity. Even though she couldn't publicly articulate this strategy without undermining traditional justifications, para-royal authority were based on concepts de superior bloodlines. Her correspondence con her daughter, Maria Antonieta, reveals Uma Mother Quien was trying to prepare her child para marriage into the French royal family, whilst also warning her about genetic risks, she couldn't explain directly. Her letters are filled con-coded advice about choosing healthy partners, avoiding certain types of family marriages, why prioritizing the health of future children over political considerations. Guidance Maria Antonieta would tragically fail to follow completely durante her later years. Maria Teresa became una informal advisor to other European royal families about what she discreetly called bloodline management. Her influence helped gradually shift European royal marriage practices away from extreme endogamy toward arrangements balanced political advantage con genetic health. Though these changes occurred slowly, why often without explicit acknowledgement their genetic rationale. Her death in 1780 marked the end of an era when Habsburg genetic problems could be ignored. Explained away as divine will, her successors would inherit not just her political reforms, but also her genetic legacy, a bloodline had been partially refreshed through her strategic marriage choices. Providing Uma foundation, the relative health would allow the Habsburg dynasty to continue para several more generations before finally ending in the 20th century. Tu te alejas del Hofburg mientras the afternoon light fades into evening, carrying the understanding sometimes the greatest acts to leadership require, acknowledging truths threaten the very foundations to power. Why the courage to change ancient practices may be the only way to preserve what's truly valuable about the traditions we inherit from those who came before us. To cruzas ahora the Pyrenees, bajo and ski threaten storm, siguiendo mountain roads connect Austria, con the troubled kingdoms de Iberia, donde political upheaval, a genetic inheritance intersect in ways to create perfect storms de human tragedy. Caminas por the corridors del Palacio Real de Madrid, donde el air feels thick con intrigue, politica, something more personal. The scent de mental illness has been passed down through bloodlines, como an unwelcome inheritance, no amount de royal privilege can cure. A 1788, y tu sigues, whispered conversations, Hatia private chambers donde una princesa de 38 años struggles against demons, que were bred into her bloodline centuries before her birth. Carlota Joaquina de Borbón, Infanta de España y future Queen de Portugal, paces restlessly in a room has been specially modified to prevent self-injury during her increasingly frequent episodes of what court physicians discreetly call royal madness. You can see in her movements the same nervous energy had characterized her ancestor, Juana la Loca, pero amplified by additional generations de genetic accumulation had made mental instability almost inevitable in certain branches of the Spanish royal family. Her hands shake, con a tremor she tries to hide behind fans, gloves. Her eyes dart constantly toward shadows, may not exist outside her own mind. Los Bourbon dynasty Habia replaced the Habsburgs on Spain. Durante the War to Spanish Succession, but they had made the crucial mistake immediately marrying back into the same genetically compromised bloodlines QA had destroyed their predecessors. Carlota Joaquina was the product repeated marriages between Spanish Bourbons and Austrian Habsburgs, essentially recreating the same genetic problems he had made Carlos II incapable ruling effectively. Her genealogy reads, Como a genetic disaster blueprint, concentrated inheritance from multiple lines QA, had been practicing endogamy para centuries. La Historia Convencional presents Carlota Joaquina como una minor royal, whose political influence was limited to Portuguese court intrigue. Pero tú descubres una more tragic narrative mientras, examining psychiatric records were kept secretly by court physicians. Her condition, which manifested as alternating periods manic energy, profound depression, fits perfectly con modern diagnostic criteria. Parabipolar disorder, una condition, que has strong genetic components, que appears with higher frequency in populations, que have experienced prolonged inbreeding. Aquí tienes una medical detail que illuminates the progression de genetic mental illness and royal families. Carlota Joaquina's episodes followed patterns que were documented in her grandmother, great-grandmother, with several aunts, creating what amounted to una family pedigree de psychiatric illness, que court physicians began to recognize as hereditary rather than coincidental. Her medical records include some the earliest attempts at genetic counseling, as physicians tried to predict which her children might inherit her condition, and how severe their symptoms might become. Tu la observa durante one to her good days, cuando her mental clarity allows her to participate on core functions, and you can see the intelligence y charisma que made her politically formidable cuando her illness was under control. But you also noticed the constant vigilance to her attendants, who had learned to recognize early signs the episodes could turn violent or self-destructive without warning. Her life had become una carefully managed balance between public appearances, a private medical management, que exhausted everyone around her. Los historiadores aún discuten whether Carlota Joaquina's political intrigues were motivated by rational calculation or by manic episodes, que drove her to make increasingly erratic decisions. Pero her personal correspondence reveals una woman quien was painfully aware de her mental instability. Yurabi tried desperately to time her political activities during periods when she felt most mentally stable. Her letters include detailed descriptions de her symptoms, que realidad, como early psychiatric case studies. Her marriage to João de Portugal had been arranged, partly because Portuguese physicians believed que their royal bloodline might provide genetic balance para Spanish mental instability. Pero the strategy backfired because Portuguese royalty had their own history. The endogamous marriages, que had created different but equally serious genetic problems. Their children inherited combinations de mental illness from both parents, creating algumas de the most severe psychiatric cases in European royal history. Tu caminas por the gardens, where Carlota Joaquina spent hours during her manic episodes, sometimes laughing hysterically at jokes que only she could hear, sometimes weeping inconsolably over tragedies que existed only in her mind. Her gardeners had learned to remove anything que could be used for self-harm during her worst periods. Why? Her favorite walking paths had been modified to prevent her from wandering off during episodes de desorientación que could last for days. La tragédie más profonde de Carlota Joaquina's story era que she had inherited not just mental illness, but also una sharp intelligence, que made her fully aware de her condition during her periods de lucidity. Her private diary, written en código que wasn't deciphered until modern times, contains heartbreaking entries about her fear that she was becoming like my grandmother. Cayenne died mad on a castle, talking to people who weren't there. She had developed a sophisticated understanding de her own psychology decades before psychiatry existed, como a formal medical discipline. Her relationship with her children reveals the double burden de royal motherhood cuando mental illness runs in the family. She loved them desperately, pero also feared them, knowing que some of them would inherit her condition, pero unable to predict which ones or how severely they would be affected. Her letters to them are filled con advice about recognizing early symptoms, managing stress, why finding reliable medical support, essentially creating una family manual para surviving genetic mental illness durante her final years. Carlota Joaquina became increasingly isolated as her episodes grew more frequent, why severe. Portuguese court records describe una woman quien alternated between periods de brilliant political insight, a complete psychological collapse, often within the same day. Her physicians documented her condition con scientific precision, que reveals how much European medicine had learned about mental illness through bitter experience. Con royal families quien couldn't hide their genetic inheritance behind closed doors. Her death in 1830 was officially attributed to brain fever, but the symptoms described by her physicians suggest that she may have suffered from complications related to long-term psychiatric medication, or possibly suicide, during una particularly severe depressive episode. Her final words, according to her confessor, were uma prayer asking God to forgive her ancestors, para mixing our blood too closely, I cursing their children con madness, tu te alejas del palace mientras storm clouds gather over Madrid. Carrying conti the understanding que mental illness in royal families wasn't just individual tragedy, but collective consequence de genetic decisions made by previous generations, quien valued political purity over psychological health, creating inheritance patterns que would affect their descendants para centuries después. Tu viajas ahora hacia el norte de España, donde Cantabrian winds carry the salt spray del Bay de Biscay y something more ethereal. Whispers de una love story que was destined to become tragedy before it even began. Caminas por the elegant corridors del Palacio Real de Madrid durante una breve autumn in 1878. Cuando political tensions, genetic inheritance conspired to create what would become one of the most heartbreaking examples de how royal blood, no matter how carefully preserved, could not protect against the biological consequences de centuries de endogamous marriage practices. Mercedes de Orleans y Bourbon stands at una window overlooking gardens que bloom con latte roses, their beauty made more poignant by the approaching winter que will soon claim them. At apenas 17 años, she embodies everything que the Spanish people had hoped para en una queen: beauty, grace, intelligence, y, most importantly, genuine affection. Para the young King Alfonso I, quien had chosen her as his bride against a considerable political opposition. But two can see in her delicate features the subtle signs de genetic fragility que had been accumulating in European royal bloodlines para-generations. Markers que no amount to happiness could overcome. Los Orleans family had been one de the more genetically diverse branches de European royalty, having occasionally married outside the traditional circle de interrelated royal houses. Pero Mercedes's immediate ancestry still carried the genetic burden de centuries de strategic endogamy. Her father, Antoine de Orléans, Duc de Montpensier, had married Infanta Luisa Fernanda de España, creating another link in the complex web de relationships que connected all European royal families. Two can trace Mercedes's genetic inheritance, como una map de European political alliances. Each marriage designed to strengthen political bonds had also concentrated genetic risks, in ways que her era couldn't understand pero that modern science would recognize como dangerous. La Historia Convencional presents Mercedes como una fairy tale princess, whose brief marriage represented a golden moment in Spanish royal history. Pero tú descubres una more complex truth. Mientras examining medical records que were kept discreetly by royal physicians, her physical examination before marriage had revealed what doctors diplomatically called constitutional delicacy, symptoms que modern medicine would recognize como possible indicators de genetic disorders that could affect her ability to survive the physical stresses de pregnancy y childbirth. Aquí tienes una medical curiosity que reveals how closely European royal families monitored genetic health by the 19th century. Mercedes underwent what amounted to genetic screening avant la lettre. Con physicians conducting detailed examinations, not just de her immediate health, but to her family medical history going back several generations. They had noted patterns de early death, reproductive difficulties, why what they called nervous conditions, and both the Orleans by Spanish royal lines. Creating reports, que were essentially primitive genetic assessments disguised como premarital medical evaluations. Tú la observas durante her wedding ceremony in January 1878, where she appears radiant con happiness, but also fragile and ways que extend beyond normal bridal nervousness. Her dress, designed to showcase royal magnificence, also conceals the physical monitoring devices que her physicians had recommended, specially designed corsets que could detect irregular heartbeat. Padding que would reveal any unusual bruising. Why fabrics que had been treated con solutions. Qui would change color if she developed fever. Medical innovations que reflected growing awareness to how quickly genetic conditions could become life-threatening on royal women. Los historiadores aún discuten whether Mercedes's death, apenas 5 months after her wedding, was caused by typhus. As officially reported, by complications related to genetic conditions, QE made her unusually vulnerable to infections. Pero the detailed medical records kept by her physicians suggest una combination de both factors. Her immune system appears to have been compromised by inherited factors que made routine illnesses potentially fatal. Uma pattern que had become increasingly common among European royalty durante the 19th century. Her brief marriage to Alfonso XII reveals uma love story que was both genuine and tragic. Their correspondence, preserved en royal archives, shows duas young people qui were genuinely devoted to each other, but also increasingly aware que something was wrong con Mercedes's health. Alfonso's letters describe his growing anxiety about her delicate constitution. His desperate attempts to find medical treatments Kyoe could strengthen her against what he intuitively understood was genetic vulnerability rather than temporary illness. To Caminas, pour the chambers where Mercedes spent her final weeks. You can see how the rooms had been modified to accommodate her increasing medical needs. The air circulation had been improved to reduce infection risk. The lighting had been adjusted to minimize neurological triggers. Why all surfaces had been covered. Con materials, Ki could be easily sterilized. Modifications K reveal how much 19th century medicine had learned about managing genetic health conditions through environmental controls. La tragédie más profonde de Mercedes' story era que. Her death occurred just as she was beginning to understand her own genetic inheritance. Her personal diary, discovered decades later, contains entries where she wondered whether her frequent illnesses were connected to similar problems Kyoe had affected her female relatives. She had begun asking questions about family medical histories. Kyoe made her physicians uncomfortable because they suggested that she was developing understanding the genetic inheritance. Kyoe challenged traditional beliefs about divine right, why royal superiority. Her funeral became national mourning event, but it also marked turning point and Spanish royal genetics. Alfonso XII's grief was so profound que he became determined to understand why his wife had died so young, leading him to consult physicians across Europe about genetic health on royal families. His subsequent marriage to Maria Cristina de Austria was chosen partly based in genetic considerations rather than purely political factors, representing shift toward what would eventually become modern genetic counseling. Mercedes's brief life had exposed the growing crisis, genetic health and European royalty durante, an era when such problems could no longer be hidden behind euphemisms about divine will constitutional delicacy. Her death prompted conversations among royal families about whether traditional marriage practices needed to be modified to account for medical realities. Kaza's science was beginning to understand, even if it couldn't yet fully explain them. Her legacy extends beyond personal tragedy to scientific understanding. The detailed medical records kept during her illness provided data Kyoe contributed to early genetic research, helping physicians recognize patterns inherited disease K would eventually lead to modern genetic medicine. Her suffering served purpose that she never knew about. Advancing medical knowledge Kyoe would eventually help prevent similar tragedies in future generations. Tu te alejas del palacio mientras. Evening shadows lengthen across Madrid, carrying conti the memory de young woman whose love story became cautionary tale about the biological costs, maintaining political traditions, qui prioritized bloodline purity over human health. Whose brief life illuminated genetic truths, qui her era was just beginning to discover. Tu te encuentras ahora en una hilltop overlooking all de Europe, as if the continent itself has become vast cemetery, donde cada castle. Y palace represents una marker para genetic experiments que were conducted using human lives as laboratory specimens. The wind carries whispers from todas las courts que you have visited, Cleopatra's Alexandria, Juana's Tordesillas, Maria Antonieta's Versailles, y todas las others. Caminas through garden, que seems to exist outside the team, donde roses bloom eternally pero their petals carry the faint stain de bloodlines, que had been both treasure y curse para the women quien bore them. Como evening approaches, two can see the mathematical progression que had unfolded across centuries. Como a genetic equation, written and human suffering. Each generation de royal women had inherited not just crowns and titles, but also accumulated mutations. Key had been passed down como compound interest in uma biological debt, key no amount de wealth could repay. The endogamous marriages, K had been designed to preserve power, had instead created uma. Systematic destruction, de genetic health, que had claimed queens, princesses, y empresses, con mathematical precision. Mode, recuerdas Cleopatra. The last Ptolemaic queen Kien had managed to inherit intelligence and a y charisma, despite 3 centuries to sibling marriage. Her genetic miracle had been possible only because she was the end product de uma bloodline quo a, had literally exhausted its capacity para further endogamy. The Egyptian experiment en royale endogamy had run its course. Ye died con her, but not before establishing uma template que European dynasties would follow para centuries. Despite having access to Ptolemaic records, Coué documented the genetic costs to such practices. The Trastamara line had repeated the Ptolemaic pattern con tragic precision, culminating in Juana la Loca, whose madness was as much genetic as emotional. Her story connected directly to Isabel la Católica, whose brilliant political mind had been unable to recognize Qui. Her marriage strategies were creating the genetic foundation para her daughter's psychological collapse. Each generation de Trastamara women had paid higher prices para bloodline purity, until the cost became literally unbearable. Los Habsburgs had perfected endogamy como una art form, creating una genetic webcam stretched across Europe. It trapped generations de women in cycles de reproductive failure, mental illness, why early death. From Anna de Austria's melancholy to Margarita Teresa's physical fragility, from Anna Mauritia's bone disease to Maria Theresa's migraines, each Habsburg woman had carried genetic burdens que had been accumulating para centuries, como layers de sediment in una geological formation. Two can see now que even the apparent successes, como Isabel de Portugal y Maria Teresa, had achieved their genetic victories only by introducing diversity from outside the traditional endogamous circles, essentially proving que the royal obsession con bloodline purity was biologically counterproductive. Their healthier children had been the result not to superior royal genetics, but to genetic rescue through outcrossing. The Spanish Bourbon line had demonstrated que changing dynasties without changing marriage practices simply transferred genetic problems from one family to another. Carlota Joaquina's madness, y Mercedes de Orleans's early death, showed que 19th century royal families had learned little from centuries de genetic evidence, continuing to prioritize political convenience over biological health. Even as scientific understanding began to emerge, los historiadores aún discuten whether these royal families understood the genetic consequences de their marriage practices. Pero, the evidence suggests que many royal women had developed intuitive understanding the inheritance patterns centuries before official science acknowledged them. Their private letters via diaries contain discussions de bloodline health, family weaknesses, why constitutional inheritance que reveals sophisticated genetic thinking disguised as religious or medical discourse. The true irony to this history is que the very practice designed to preserve royal power had systematically undermined it. Each generation de endogamous marriages had reduced the genetic fitness to royal bloodlines, creating rulers qui were increasingly unable to fulfill their biological or political functions. The divine right to kings had been undermined not by revolution pero by genetics, as royal families literally bred themselves toward extinction. Aquitianus, the final medical curiosity que illuminates the complete picture. Modern genetic analysis to preserved royal DNA has confirmed que European royal families during the height de endogamy had genetic diversity levels comparable to laboratory mouse populations. QA had been deliberately inbred para research purposes. These women had been unwitting subjects and genetic experiments que no modern ethics committee would approve. Sacrificing their health, EY lives, para-political theories about bloodline superiority que were scientifically nonsensical. The legacy to these royal women extends beyond individual tragedy to scientific advancement. Their carefully documented medical histories provided the foundation para early genetic research. Why? Their suffering contributed to understanding inheritance patterns, que eventually led to modern genetic medicine. En uma sense, their tragic lives served uma greater purpose, proving definitively que human genetic health requires diversity. Why que social systems que oppose this biological necessity will ultimately destroy themselves. But perhaps most importantly, these women's stories reveal the profound courage que was required to live dentro systems. Que were designed to sacrifice their well-being, para-abstract concepts, to political purity. Many de them had recognized intuitively que something was wrong con their family traditions. Why some had even attempted to implement changes, but they were constrained. Poor political systems que valued theoretical bloodline superiority over actual human health. Como night falls across this imaginary garden, donde all these royal women's spirits seem to gather. Two can hear their voices joining in una conversation que spans centuries. What if we had chosen love over lineage? What if we had prioritized health over heredity? What if we had valued human well-being over political theory? Their questions echo across time como reminders. Que, the most important choices, are often about what we decide to preserve and what we have the courage to change. The dark side de royal blood was never really about the blood itself, pero about human systems que we treated people como breeding stock rather than individuals worthy to health. Happiness. Why choice? These women's lives illuminate the difference between honoring tradition, why being imprisoned, pour it, between preserving what's valuable from the past, a blindly repeating mistakes, que cause unnecessary suffering. Now, as our journey through these shadowed palaces comes to its gentle end, let yourself breathe slowly and deeply, feeling the weight of these ancient stories settling like silk around your shoulders. The queens and princesses we have visited tonight exist now only in whispers carried by evening winds, but their voices still speak to something universal in the human experience. The tension between love and duty, between preserving what we've inherited and protecting what we hope to create. You have walked with women who lived in gilded cages of their own bloodlines, who loved deeply despite genetic destinies they could not escape, who found moments of joy even when their very DNA seemed designed to create sorrow. Their stories remind us that courage is not the absence of suffering, but the choice to remain human and hopeful in the face of circumstances beyond our control. These royal women, separated by centuries and countries, shared something more profound than bloodlines. They shared the very human struggle to find meaning and connection, despite systems that reduce them to genetic equations. Their laughter still echoes in palace gardens. Their tears still water the roses that bloom in royal courtyards. Their love still illuminates the portraits that hang in museums around the world. As sleep begins to claim you, let their spirits watch over your dreams. Not as haunted figures, but as gentle guardians who learned that the truest nobility comes not from the purity of our blood, but from the kindness in our hearts. The wisdom to question what we inherit, and the courage to choose love over legacy when the two cannot coexist. Their stories end here, but yours continues. Written not in bloodlines, but in the choices you make each day to treat yourself and others with the dignity and care that these royal women sometimes found, sometimes lost, but always deserved. Rest now, knowing that the most precious inheritance is not what flows through our veins, but what flows from our hearts